The Old West wasn't just gunfire, dust, and duels at sunset. Between the 19th century and the early 20th, expansion across the United States created figures as strange as they were unforgettable. Doctors who turned gunslingers into boots, thieves who left poems inside safes. Want to hear 25 of these stories? Then subscribe and come along with us. Number 1. George Big Nose Parrott roamed the Old West, robbing stagecoaches and leaving a trail of violence. But what truly made him legendary was the fate of his body. In 1881, after being captured, he was lynched by an enraged crowd and handed over to doctor and politician John Eugene Osborne in Wyoming. Instead of simply recording the death, Osborne decided to turn the corpse into an experiment. He had the outlaw's skin tanned and used it to order a pair of boots in a medical bag. Years later, he actually showed off those boots on the very day he took office as governor of the state, as if he were literally carrying the criminal under his feet. Parrott's skull also became an object of morbid curiosity. Sawed in half, it served as an ashtray, a doorstop, and a pencil holder in the office of Lillian Held, Wyoming's first female doctor. To top it off, Osborne and his colleague Thomas Mackey studied the outlaw's brain in search of physical signs that might explain his criminal life, reflecting the era's exaggerated belief that the mind could be read through anatomy. And so, the man who lived as a symbol of chaos ended up turned into a piece of questionable science, a political souvenir, and a disturbing reminder of how far human curiosity can go when mixed with a thirst for punishment and public spectacle. Number 2. In the imagination of the Old West, few names carry as much violence as John Wesley Hardin's. He himself claimed to have taken the lives of 41 men, a reputation that followed him into his trial and through his long stretch in prison, where he spent more than 20 years. When he got out, he didn't find redemption, but an ending that matched the life he'd lived. In 1895, he was shot in the back by John Selman inside a busy saloon in El Paso. Years earlier, in 1877, Hardin was in Abilene, Kansas, lost in the noise of cards, booze, and smoke that filled the gambling hall. After hours of betting, he and a farmer named Charles Huger decided to rest in neighboring rooms of a simple hotel. In the middle of the night, the silence was shattered by loud snoring coming from the room next door. Annoyed, Hardin yelled, demanding quiet. When no one answered, he pulled out his revolver, aimed at the thin wooden wall, and fired several times. The bullets went through the divider and hit Huger, who died without even waking up, reduced to just another number in the gunslinger's grim tally. For Hardin, the episode became just another story to tell between drinks and bitter laughs, as if someone else's life were a disposable detail. For those who listened, however, it was clear that around men like him, even a simple sleep problem could turn into a death sentence. Number 3. Fort Griffin, in the heart of Texas, started as a military outpost by Clear Creek and the Brazos, but it quickly became much more than a dot on the map. The makeshift tents turned into saloons, gambling tables, and noisy boarding houses, drawing in everything that wandered the West: cowboys worn out from long cattle drives, gunslingers looking for quick money, buffalo hunters, outlaws, hustlers, and women who lived off the endless nights. It didn't take long for the town's reputation to spread across the plains and earn it the nickname Babylon on the Brazos. There, nobody asked much about anyone's past. Having a few dollars in your pocket or a gun on your hip was enough to find a spot at the bar. In the middle of the smoke, the smell of cheap whiskey, and the rough laughter, walked figures who would later become legends. John Wesley Hardin is said to have walked those dusty streets, carrying his deadly reputation. Doc Holliday appeared among marked cards and half-empty glasses, almost always in the company of Kate, known as Big Nose Kate, used to facing dangerous men without blinking. That was Fort Griffin, a refuge of freedom and risk, a turbulent slice of the Old West where, with every sunset, no one knew whether the night would end in a party, a duel, or a silent disappearance. Number 4. Charles Earl Bowles became known in the Old West as Black Bart, the poet Bandit. Born in England, he crossed the ocean as a young man and settled with his family in New York. When the gold rush set the United States on fire in 1849, he headed to the Carolinas in search of fortune, but found a fate very different from what he'd imagined. There, he began noticing the prosperous Wells Fargo stagecoaches crossing isolated roads, carrying money, mail, and hope. The temptation became too strong. With manners rare among outlaws, a face covered by a bandana, and an almost gentlemanly attitude, he started intercepting those vehicles and emptying their lockboxes. What really made him famous, though, was his habit of leaving poems at the scene of the robbery. On scraps of paper he scribbled short, rhymed taunts signed as Black Bart, which quickly spread through the newspapers. In total, 28 holdups were attributed to him before his capture, trial, and imprisonment. After serving his sentence, he chose to leave behind both the gun and the anonymity of the open road. He returned to New York, where he lived a quiet life until his death in 1917, ending the journey of the thief who blended crime, poetry, and legend into a single story. His legacy stayed alive in songs, books, and saloon tales, reminding people that even crime can take on new shapes when it crosses paths with the power of words. Number 5. In the Old West, serving a glass of whiskey meant much more than quenching your thirst after a day of dust and riding. That liquid carried challenge, status, and danger, so much so that it was called firewater by indigenous peoples who watched, amazed, at the merchant's demonstration. To show off the power of the drink, all it took was a simple trick. Pour a thin golden stream over an open flame. The fire would jump up instantly, fed by the alcohol, as if the whole glass could set the night on fire. Behind that spectacle was a mix that was anything but innocent. The whiskey was made from raw alcohol, burnt sugar, and even chewing tobacco, a combination that produced a harsh flavor and an immediate hit to the body. It wasn't about savoring, it was about enduring. Anyone who faced the first shot felt their chest burn, their vision get heavy, and the world around them lose its shape. Within minutes, it was clear why this was the drink of choice for gamblers, worn-out cowboys, and jittery gunslingers. One swallow worked like improvised courage, but it could also spark fights, reckless decisions, and gunshots fired in the heat of the moment, cementing whiskey's reputation as the most feared liquid danger in the entire West. Between gambling tables, slamming doors, and whispered secrets, every bottle seemed to promise quick power, always demanding a steep price in return. Number 6. Behind many spectacles, there are stories no one would ever imagine. Elmer J. McCurdy, a bank and train robber, died in 1911 in a shootout with police in Oklahoma. With no family to claim his body, he ended up in the hands of Joseph L. Johnson, the local undertaker, who decided to turn the dead man into an attraction. He embalmed the corpse, dressed Elmer like an outlaw, put a rifle in his hands, and started charging a penny to anyone who wanted a close look. Time passed, and 2 men showed up claiming to be Elmer's brothers. Johnson, believing their story, handed over the body. But they weren't relatives. They were owners of a traveling carnival. And so, the corpse became part of a macabre sideshow, displayed from town to town as if it were just another odd-looking prop, shown to crowds who never knew who he'd actually been in life. Decades later, the now deteriorated body was dumped in a warehouse in Los Angeles, forgotten among leftover set pieces and broken mannequins. He was only rediscovered in 1949, when someone noticed that this dummy still had traces of human tissue. After many years of display, deception, and abandonment, Elmer finally received a proper burial, ending not only a turbulent life but also a long and unlikely post-mortem journey. His story remains a troubling reminder of how even death can be turned into spectacle. Number 7. In popular imagination, the name that dominates Old West stories is Jesse James, but in the shadow of his fame stood his older brother Frank James, seen by many as even more ruthless. Together, they led the feared James Younger gang, which crossed multiple states robbing banks and trains, leaving behind a trail of fear, injuries, and deaths wherever they went. For some, they were rebels fighting what they saw as an unjust system. For others, they were nothing more than cold criminals who turned violence into routine. When Jesse was killed in 1882, Frank's world seemed to fall apart. Tired of running and of carrying the weight of his own name, he made an unexpected decision. He turned himself into the governor of Missouri and summed up his own life with a harsh, simple line, saying he had literally lived in the saddle and had never had a single day of complete peace. Taken to trial for a long list of crimes, he was ultimately acquitted. Stepping away from his former life, he spent his last 3 decades working ordinary jobs and trying to build a new identity, until his death in 1915, as a man who had known both the dark glory of crime and the quiet anonymity that came after. Today, his story remains a reminder of how fragile the line between myth and crime can be, shaped by the versions of history that manage to endure. Number 8. James Killer. Miller, the feared Deacon Jim, walked between two worlds. On one side, he was the cold gunman who, according to official records, was accused of killing 14 men, while many swore his victims were closer to 50. Some were certain he was also behind the death of Pat Garrett, the legendary sheriff who took down Billy the Kid, which only added to the dark aura around his name. On the other side, he appeared as a devoted Methodist, always dressed in a sharp suit, sitting in the front pews at church and ready to help with ceremonies, never touching alcohol or cigarettes. His reputation for being unkillable grew after he survived 4 shots to the chest, protected by a steel plate hidden under his clothes, a trick that fueled saloon tales and made many think twice before challenging him. In the same region where hymns were heard on Sundays, people whispered about the man who blended devotion with paid killings. In 1909, an enraged crowd decided that official justice was too slow and hanged Miller, ending the life of the killer Deacon. The creak of the rope on the gallows became the last legend tied to his name. He entered Old West lore not just for the bodies he left behind, but for the contradiction of a man who prayed in public and, far from the altar, lived by the sight of his gun. Number 9. In 1870, a traveler stopped at a rest point between Elizabethtown and Taos in New Mexico. The cabin was run by Charles Kennedy, a big bearded man, and his wife Rose, a Ute woman. The couple lived there with their 5-year-old son, a sharp-eyed boy who watched every stranger who passed through. When the traveler climbed down from his horse, the boy walked up to him and whispered a warning. His father was a murderer, and he would be the next victim. It sounded like a child's fantasy, but those words hung heavy in the evening air. Moments later, the warning became a sentence. Kennedy waited for the right moment, pulled the trigger, and killed the traveler without hesitation. Then, to silence the only witness who dared to speak, he turned the gun on his own son. It wasn't an isolated incident. For years, Kennedy lured in and killed anyone who crossed his path, stealing whatever they carried. His cabin, lost in the dry landscape of the Old West, became the final stop for travelers who never reached their destination. Over time, the string of disappearances drew attention from nearby communities. Stories of men who left and never returned always pointed back to the same stretch of road. And so, Charles Kennedy's name stopped being just that of a rest stop keeper and took its place among the darkest legends of the Old West, tied to a trail of deaths that marked the territory. Number 10. In the 1870s in rural Kansas, an inn along the trail seemed like nothing more than a refuge for tired travelers. The Benders lived there. John, his wife Elvira, their daughter Katie, and their son John Jr., always ready to serve a meal and offer a bed. Over time, people in the area began to notice a disturbing pattern. Those seen entering the inn were not seen leaving. Abandoned wagons, Unanswered letters and families waiting for news fueled suspicion until rumor turned into direct accusation. Not trusting the distant authorities, neighbors organized searches and entered the property. The dining room looked ordinary, but the floor hid a secret. Under the wooden planks, in a dark cellar, shallow graves began to appear. Every shovelful of dirt revealed another body, some still in travel clothes, each one showing signs of violent death. The discovery sparked panic and outrage. Armed groups formed, determined to track down the Benders. When they were finally found, John, Elvira, and John Jr. were killed by the community. Katie, trapped and surrounded by fire, died in a blaze that ended any chance of a trial. Since then, the story of the Bloody Benders has been told as one of the darkest episodes of the Old West, a reminder that the promise of shelter could hide the final trap. Number 11. In the Old West, poker tables weren't just places for betting. They were survival arenas. Anyone who knew the dangers of that land made sure to sit with their back against the wall, facing the main door, keeping every movement in the saloon within sight. One careless moment could cost you money, your reputation, and often your life. That's what happened in 1876 in Deadwood, in the Dakota Territory. James Butler Hickok, the legendary Wild Bill, walked into the Nutella and Mance saloon and followed his old habit. He chose a chair that gave him a clear view of the entrance, shuffled the cards, and settled in as if nothing could catch him off guard. While chips clinked and conversations filled the room, he trusted the instincts he'd built over years of gunslinging and gambling. What Hickok didn't notice was the quiet creeping up behind him. Jack McCall, humiliated in a previous game, decided that revenge wouldn't come at the table, but through a gun. He slipped in through the back door, approached unnoticed, and fired point blank. A single shot cut through the noise of the saloon and sent one of the most feared and talked about names of the Wild West crashing onto his cards. His death spread across the territories and became legend, a reminder that out there, not even the most watchful man controlled the next move. Number 12. Mary Catherine Harney, nicknamed Big Nose Kate because of her large nose, seemed destined for a comfortable life. Born into a wealthy family, she grew up surrounded by privilege until the early death of her parents tore her from that protected world and placed her in a foster home, where she learned early that nothing was guaranteed. Years later, as an adult, she tried to start over with a husband she also lost too soon. Alone once again, she packed her bags and headed to Texas, betting that a new town might give her some control over her own fate. There, she found work in saloons as a dancer and prostitute, moving among gamblers, outlaws, and people living on the razor's edge. It was in that smoky world that she crossed paths with Doc Holliday, the gunman and card player who would later become Wyatt Earp's partner in the famous OK Corral shootout. Their relationship mixed passion, loyalty, and danger. More than a lover, Kate became an accomplice and stepped into his risky schemes. In one of them, realizing Holliday might end up in prison for many years, she set fire to a shed to distract the authorities and create the chaos needed for his escape, proving just how far she was willing to go to avoid losing, once again, the only person she considered family. And in doing so, she cemented her place in the shadows of the Old West. Number 13. In the Old West, the bandana was as important as the hat, the saddle, or the pistol. Life on dusty trails demanded something to protect the face and lungs during days of riding behind cattle, and the cloth tied around the neck did that job with simple efficiency. All you had to do was pull it up over your mouth and nose when the wind kicked up dirt or when rain turned everything into mud. Far from being just decoration, the bandana helped prevent sunburn on the neck, worked as an improvised glove to grab a hot pan, wrapped an injured hand, wiped sweat, and even warmed the ears on nights when the campfire couldn't beat the cold. In tight situations, it could become a tourniquet, a signal for help, or a prearranged marker between companions. There was also a darker side. With one quick motion, the same bandana turned into a mask, hiding the faces of cowboys, thieves, or bounty hunters during bank, stagecoach, or train robberies. Between dust, danger, and necessity, that simple piece of cloth became part of the West's very identity, a symbol of adaptation and of everything a person had to do to stay alive. In saloons and little frontier towns, it followed its owner quietly, tucked in a pocket or hanging from the neck, always ready for whatever came next. That's why, more than an accessory, it became a trademark of that whole territory. Number 14. Alice Ivers arrived in the United States in 1865, leaving behind England and the strict discipline of a girls' boarding school. She settled in Colorado, where the saloons buzzed with music, smoke, and high-stakes gambling. It was in that environment that she, curious and sharp, learned poker and started playing in a saloon in Creede run by Bob Ford, the man who would later become known for killing Jesse James. Over time, Alice became an attraction. The cards seemed to obey her, and her presence drew the attention of anyone who walked through the door. It didn't take long before she earned the nickname Poker Alice. She combined skill and composure with the ability to charm her opponents through talk and calculated glances, pulling in crowds and filling the gaming tables. One night she stunned everyone by winning $6,000, a fortune for that era. But the same life that took her to the top also came with a price. In 1910, during a brawl in one of her own saloons, Alice shot and killed a soldier. The incident ended in jail time and permanently stained the reputation she had built at the poker tables, bringing a bitter end to the career of one of the most talked-about figures in Old West saloons. Even so, her name kept circulating in stories told in dimly lit rooms, as an example of how the search for freedom and fortune could blur into risk, excess, and downfall. Number 15. Pearl Hart was born in Canada, and as a teenager became fascinated with the myth of the Old West after watching a Buffalo Bill show. The sense of freedom and adventure stayed with her so strongly that, at 17, she left her family and headed to Arizona in search of a life of her own. There she met Joe Wood, with whom she became involved both romantically and criminally. The couple lived off small scams until they decided to try something bigger. In 1899, they chose a stagecoach as their target and carried out a robbery that shocked the region, not only for its boldness, but also because a woman was the one holding the gun. The escape didn't last, though. Unprepared for the desert, they became disoriented, were found by a patrol, and taken into custody. In jail, Pearl became national news. She was only the second woman to rob a stagecoach and the first to survive to tell the tale. The prison system, however, wasn't built to house women, and after 18 months in an improvised cell, she received a pardon and walked away from the outlaw life, carrying both the fame and the burden of having defied the expectations of her time. Years later, her name would still appear in newspapers, pulp stories, and oral tales, sometimes as a rebellious heroine, sometimes as a criminal, reminding people that the West wasn't shaped only by gunslingers, but also by women determined to write their own destiny. Number 16. In the mid-19th century, riding more than 1,250 miles on horseback sounded like madness. Even so, the Pony Express took on that mission, delivering letters and newspapers from Missouri to Sacramento in record time. About 160 years ago, when the American West was still a land of risks and uncertainty, their deliveries took an average of just 10 days, something impressive even today. The system was ingenious. Along the route, small stations kept fresh horses ready and riders on standby. Every 12 miles, a new horse took over. At key points, the rider was swapped out too. That way, the mail moved almost non-stop, crossing plains, mountains, and deserts with an urgency that foreshadowed modern communication. Even with all that effort, The Pony Express lasted only 18 months. The service proved it was possible to shrink distances within the United States, connecting the Midwest to the West with unheard-of efficiency. But the numbers didn't add up. The losses hit $110,000, and the government chose to keep stagecoaches as the main postal method. What remained of the Pony Express was the legacy of a brief, bold experiment, remembered today as a symbol of an era when courage and speed began reshaping the history of American communication and inspiring generations fascinated by great crossings. Number 17. In the mid-19th century, the United States Army faced a major challenge: how to cross the dry, harsh regions of the South and West. In 1856, officers looked to armies in Asia and North Africa, where camels had been used for centuries in desert campaigns. If those animals had already proven their worth on another continent, why not test them on American soil? The idea became reality with the arrival of 66 camels brought from the Middle East to a military post in Camp Verde, Texas. That's where a series of tests began. It didn't take long to see that the animals handled heat well, traveled long distances with little water, and carried heavy loads without showing signs of exhaustion. Compared to horses and mules, they seemed tailor-made for that environment. But the excitement didn't last. Used to the logic of traditional cavalry, many soldiers struggled to deal with the camels, which didn't respond to commands the same way and quickly gained a reputation for being difficult, grumpy, and unpredictable. The relationship was tense, and troop resistance to the new model grew. After the Civil War, the project was shut down, the unit disbanded, and the animals were sold or released. And so the camel experiment in the U.S. Army ended as a brief episode, remembered more as a curious trial than a real shift in the country's military strategy. Number 18. Among the Apache peoples, taking an enemy's scalp worked as both a war trophy and a public record of courage. Each displayed scalp told a story of ambushes, pursuits, and duels, marking the survivor as someone feared both inside and outside the tribe. The act was also part of a prestige system. The more trophies a warrior presented, the greater his voice in councils, the greater his influence over alliances and decisions of attack. With European expansion across North America, settlers quickly noticed the symbolic impact of this ritual and began to imitate it, using the same practice to spread fear, claim bounties, and assert dominance over indigenous rivals, personal enemies, and even neighbors suspected of betrayal. Little by little, the taken scalp stopped being just a native symbol and became a kind of currency of power on the violent frontier of the West. During the American Civil War, this logic reached another level. Groups of Confederate guerrillas, like those led by William Bloody Bill Anderson, adopted quick executions followed by scalping as a tool of terror. It wasn't just about winning the battle. The goal was to leave visible marks that would circulate as warnings and constant reminders that, in that conflict, the enemy's body could also be turned into a message. Number 19. Called St. Elmo's fire, the glow that puzzled sailors for centuries appears when the air around them is filled with an intense electric field. The molecules become ionized, and for a few moments the darkness is streaked with bluish or whitish light that seems to dance around masts, ropes, and metal edges during storms. Many sailors saw this silent glow as a mysterious warning, sometimes a sign of protection, other times of imminent danger. Far from the sea, in the dusty expanses of the Old West, the same phenomenon showed up in an even more unsettling way. From time to time, the light would spark on the horns of cattle or outline the ears of horses, as if a cold flame were rising from the animals themselves. At first glance, it was just electricity reacting to the dry air of the plains. But to those who witnessed it, it felt like something else. On nights like that, even famous gunslingers and hardened cowboys hesitated to go near those glowing shapes. as if behind that silent light something ancient were watching their every move. Over time, stories about herds marked by that glow began to circulate among saloons and camps, blending uncertain science, folk belief, and genuine fear. Few could explain what they saw, but no one ever forgot the night when the desert itself seemed to light up from within. Number 20. When we think of Western movies, we almost always picture only white cowboys riding across the plains. But on the 19th century cattle trails, the real scene was very different. It's estimated that about 1 in every 4 cowboys was black. They weren't on the sidelines. They were a central part of the work that kept the big ranches running. From sunrise to night, they drove herds over long distances, branded and marked cattle, broke wild horses, and competed in events that would later become modern rodeos. During the Civil War, many white ranch owners left for the front and put their land in the hands of enslaved people who took over the daily work and kept the ranches alive. After the war and emancipation, many of these men, now free, continued working as cowboys, finding in that experience a path to income and autonomy. Their techniques, songs, and stories passed through generations, but were almost always credited to others. Although their role was essential in shaping the image of the American West, much of that presence was erased, and revisiting their stories also means changing how we see that era, making room for a past that is fuller and truer. Number 21. In the Old West, bounty hunting was a brutal job. The money only came when the wanted man's body was delivered to the authorities, whole and in plain sight. That forced hunters to cross deserts and towns with corpses tied to horses or tossed into wagons, mixing dust, heat, and the smell of death in every journey. With the rise of photography, however, a loophole appeared that changed the game. All they had to do was take the dead man to a studio, where the photographer would capture an image that served as official proof of the capture. Many bodies were propped upright, leaning against walls or held by hidden supports, so the face would be clearly visible. As soon as the shutter clicked and confirmed the wanted man's identity, the hunter could leave the body behind, move on to the next target, and turn images into payment. The transition didn't happen overnight. There was distrust, talk of forgeries, and fear that some sheriffs wouldn't accept the photo. Little by little, though, the practice took hold. The camera became a silent witness between the gunman and the law, cutting down travel time, speeding up negotiations, and starting a new way of recording the violence that shaped that world. On that constantly contested frontier, each portrait sealed a contract between death, money, and power. Number 22. In the days of the Old West, walking into a saloon meant more than looking for cheap liquor. It was where travelers, broke cowboys, and gamblers mixed amid muted laughter, marked cards, and watchful eyes. One unpaid bet or a wrong comment was enough for the chatter to stop and a hand to slide toward a holster, changing the whole atmosphere in seconds. These places, which now look like adventure settings, were part of daily life on the frontier. Meeting spot, shelter, a place for risky deals and fragile alliances sealed over the counter. Despite the refined image spread by movies with chandeliers and polished pianos, the first saloons were simple wooden structures, makeshift shacks that barely held up against the wind and the dust of dirt roads. Only later, as towns grew, did more polished facades and carefully planned decor appear to attract outsiders. Among these saloons, the Long Branch Saloon in Kansas City became a reference point and still draws visitors interested in touching that past up close. The building seen today, however, isn't the original. The first structure was destroyed in a fire in 1895 and had to be rebuilt, leaving behind rubble but preserving in collective memory the mix of camaraderie, gambling, and danger that defines the saloon legacy of the Old West. Number 23. Tatanka Iotanka, known as Sitting Bull, grew up watching his people pushed back by the advance of colonizers. From a young age, he took on the role of warrior, guiding hunts, protecting children and elders, and helping keep the community united. His reputation for courage in battle spread quickly, but what set him apart was his belief that strength could also mean avoiding conflict. Whenever he saw an opening, he looked for dialogue to preserve land, food, and respect, trying to prevent more indigenous blood from being spilled. As the years passed, the fights against the armies of the United States and Canada exhausted his people. Surrounded, watched, and seeing the bison disappear, Sitting Bull realized that resisting in the same way would only lead to more loss. He agreed to surrender and was taken to a reservation, where white authorities imposed rules and treated his traditions as a threat. In that setting, he received an invitation to join Buffalo Bill's show. For 4 months, he rode on horseback before curious crowds, reenacting battles that in real life had brought pain and mourning. He traveled across North America and Europe, seeing up close the society that had reshaped his world. Realizing he would always be displayed as an exotic curiosity, he chose to leave the show and return to his people, preserving until the end the dignity he had sworn to defend. Number 24. In the Old West, almost everything seemed built for men, but the presence of women, even rare, changed the atmosphere of those dusty towns. In many settlements, there were 3 men for every woman. In places like California, the gap was even wider, making them almost exceptional figures. In saloons, owners quickly realized that much of the excitement came from conversation and feminine charm. So women were hired to sing, dance, lead toasts, and keep the place lively. They weren't there just as decoration. Their ability to listen to stories, spark laughter, and suggest another round kept money flowing and the business alive. The image of these workers was often reduced to the idea of prostitution, erasing the complexity of their choices and paths. Not all of them sold their bodies. Many demanded respect, set boundaries, and were seen as true ladies by the regulars. Some supported families from afar. Others were trying to rebuild their lives after losses or escapes. Amid gunshots, card games, and broken bottles, these women carved out, in their own way, a space for themselves in a world that insisted on denying them one, leaving marks that were discreet but decisive in the history of the West. Number 25. Geronimo, an Apache leader, became known as a tireless warrior in the face of the United States and Mexico's advance over his people's lands. Born in Sonora, in northern Mexico, he was taken as a young man to a village in what is now New Mexico, where he learned to hunt, trade, and above all, protect his people. For years, he refused to accept the idea of seeing the Apache confined to reservations far from their territories. He led escapes, fights, and broken agreements, challenging soldiers from 2 countries and becoming a symbol of indigenous resistance. Eventually, though, military pressure and a lack of resources took their toll, and he surrendered. In his later years, he lived under surveillance, converted to Christianity, and earned some money selling bows, arrows, and signed photographs to curious visitors. The image of the former chief on public display reveals not only defeat, but also the forced adaptation that marked the lives of many native peoples. If the world of the Old West sparks your imagination, tell us in the comments which movies, series, or books about this era caught your attention the most. Do you have a favorite Western, or have you ever watched a show inspired by that time? Don't forget to like the video, share the link with friends and family, and subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories.